Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. We are a pay and reward consultancy supporting organisations of all sizes and sectors to take a fair and equitable approach to pay, communicated clearly and honestly to employees. In this podcast, we invite experts to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the world of HR, culture and leadership. We're keen to explore how we can all work to overcome and navigate these challenges. So, tune in to explore how you could create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to.
Welcome back to another episode of A Case of the Mondays. I'm Rameez, your host, and in today's episode we're discussing how the EU Pay Transparency Directive is going to change the way organizations manage pay for their employees. Now imagine a world where you're applying for a job and you're provided with a pay range before the interview. You do well in the interview and you're being offered a fair salary without being asked what you currently get paid. In your new organization, pay disparities based on gender or ethnicity or other factors are much harder to hide. In fact, all your pay processes are communicated to you regularly. This is the world that the EU Pay Transparency Directive is aiming to create. And this new legislation is going to transform how companies approach pay, fostering an environment of transparency and equity. So today my guest is 3R Strategy's Director of Consulting, Juan Novoa. Juan has worked in Reward for over 15 years in in-house and consultancy roles and has been closely following the developments surrounding the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Welcome to the podcast, Juan.
Thank you for having me, Rameez.
I thought instead of me giving you a long introduction, maybe you could tell us a bit about how you got into Reward and I guess like me, what makes you a Reward geek that you want to read a document such as the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
A rare breed, maybe even a worrying breed.
Yeah.
Well, I've been in the world of Reward for over 15 years, but my interest in people issues, it's been far past that. I originally studied industrial engineering in university. Within that, you could go down the finance route, which was the most popular, or the people route, and I was more drawn to the people route. And then a few years after I did my MBA, I had the opportunity to do an internship at Hay Group, and then I joined them in the UK. And what I've always enjoyed about Reward is that it has the people side to it, but it also has the numbers and analytical side to it, and you have to work with both. So there's no one set formula to provide all the answers. But likewise, you need to be able to look at the numbers and the evidence to make the right decisions. And that makes really attracted me to it. Like many Reward geeks, I love a good spreadsheet, enjoy putting one together, having an elegant formula. But beyond that, what I really like is that with what we do in Reward, we really help people. We make a difference to their work life and get to use both the analytical and the human side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that about spreadsheets because I was just, it just made me think that now that, I also spend a lot of time, for example, speaking to organizations, running workshops, looking at legislation. I actually do miss that time you can spend a few hours on the spreadsheet, building something and then think, this looks nice. And then you update one cell and everything else updates in the spreadsheet. Anyway, it's we're going slightly off topic.
Getting too geeky.
Yeah. So, the EU Pay Transparency Directive, now it's something that has been discussed for a while and it came into effect or the directive was introduced last year, and they said that the overall objective or the purpose of the directive is to advance the application of equal pay for equal work. But can you let's think about the recruitment process, for example. can you tell us how this directive is going to change the dynamics of job interviews or salary negotiation or the entire recruitment process for organizations?
Absolutely. And to me, there are two key aspects of the directive that will impact on the recruitment process. The first one is the requirement to publish the pay rate for the role or the pay range for the role. And that actually will force organizations to think carefully about how they want to pay, the type of profile that they want to attract, and start driving transparency. It will also give candidates information to understand the role, to compare their expectations to what they're likely to receive. And on the whole, and there's been research to support this, it will improve the caliber of candidates, and it will lead to much better conversations at recruitment stage. The second big element is the restrictions on asking candidates about their salary history. I think this is a very powerful element because in my experience, they ask about your salary. They're trying to use that as a proxy for your seniority or experience, or how the market has valued that in the past, or it could be used as a negotiating tool to get away with not paying you what the right rate for the role is. It can be a large number of reasons, but that particular element, I think, is going to have a deep impact on contributing to equal pay and reducing the gender pay gap and creating a more level playing field for all candidates.
Yeah, I completely agree on the equal pay and gender pay gap, and there was research recently in the US, where in the US a number of states have implemented this already, and they found that the single biggest factor that impacted a reduction in their gender pay gap was to ban asking about salary history. And I think it's also an indication that it's not just a change in pay processes, but it's probably a big change in culture, because I speak to many HR professionals or recruiters in particular who, for them, this is just a regular part of their role. And I've also been told by, for example, someone who said, well, this is the first question I ask whenever I meet a candidate, because I need to determine what their skills are worth. So given that all recruiters are asking this question, I would say pretty much all hiring managers are asking this question, this is going to be a big culture change. And how do you think that organizations can start to, because culture change doesn't happen overnight, and so how do you think that organizations or HR professionals can approach this in a way that they start to talk to their hiring managers about this, that one, it's not just legislation, but it's going to help us with their EDI, or equality, diversity, inclusion policies?
Yeah, absolutely. And you probably recognize this because you've used this many times. This has to start with why. And I think this conversation needs to be framed against the wider backdrop of pay transparency, how that can impact positively employee engagement and business results. People need to be clear that this is not just about compliance or regulations. This is really about driving transparency, driving fairness, and employee engagement. So this has to be a conversation that people have over time. It needs to be supported and championed by senior leaders, and people need to be held accountable for doing their part on this. So if you have those three building blocks in place, I think that can start supporting that cultural change. It will be difficult because, as you mentioned, it is an element of process, almost automated in this recruitment conversation. So people really need to internalize that, not only that it is not allowed, but also why. And I think if people manage to drill down that message of transparency, fairness, and engagement, they will start changing those mindsets, and the accountability aspect can follow to cement that.
Yeah, completely. I mean, the why, like you said, we always talk about this, and if I think of a practical example of this, and how I think this is approached by many recruitment processes currently, where we ask a candidate what they currently get. Let's say the salary range for the job is 40 to 50,000. We ask a candidate what they currently get paid, and if they get paid 38,000, we'll say we'll offer you 40. And we ask the candidate, and they say they currently get paid 46,000, we'll say, okay, we'll give you 48. Now, those two candidates might have the same skill and experience, and they might be contributing the same, but because of what they get paid in the past, they get offered very different salaries. And I think there's a very strong link here with equality, diversity, and inclusion, because if we think that certain minority groups or women get underpaid, then all we're doing is transferring that from one organization to another. And I think that's, like you said, the why that we need to really communicate to our managers. And you're right, it really needs to come from senior leadership, because if they don't champion this, then the managers below them are not going to take it seriously.
Absolutely. And when you look at the recruitment process itself, actually, I think that once you've set the backdrop to that in terms of the messaging and the culture, the process bit shouldn't be that hard, because once you get past the salary history conversation, most competent recruiters will be having conversations about relevant skills, capability, experience, what people bring to the table that should in the end determine what they get when compared to what others are doing in the same or similar roles in the organization. So that part of them is just really cutting out that element. So once the culture bit is set, the context bit is set, then the process bit should follow and shouldn't be that difficult.
Now, we know that if we look at organizations now, there are, we can sometimes think of pay transparency as like a binary thing, that you either have it or you don't. But we know there's different levels of transparency you can have in your organization. Some organizations may just have a pay policy that they communicate. Others may have a job architecture, job evaluation. Others might communicate pay structures. And that level of transparency obviously varies by organization, but it also varies a lot by industry. Some industries are more transparent than others. Do you think that there are any particular industries or sectors that are going to struggle more with this EU directive because of the significant change that they're going to have to make, because they're very, I guess, untransparent right now?
Yeah, and I would probably approach that question from a slightly different angle, because I don't think it's so much about transparency by industry, but it's the amount of discretion that is used in decisions in those industries. So in service industries, professional services, financial services, you do tend to observe a larger degree of discretion to meet the profile of the needs of certain candidates to get the right person through the door. In other professions, in other industries where there's less the amount for discretion, or there's less variation on pay rates, you don't see as much of that. So I think that the biggest challenge will be in industries or companies where they use a lot of discretion in these decisions, because they'll need to be able to either move to a more structured and prescribed process, or they need to do the work to describe and distill what that discretion means. What is the objective and gender neutral criteria that we're using to make decisions? So that will challenge some of these organizations, and that may involve a hard look in the mirror and say, actually, we haven't been doing this right. We need to change tack. So I think in terms of the companies, industries that will be more exposed will be those where there's greater discretion being used at the moment, because that's where you are exposed to bias, to subjective criteria. So I think that's how I would view it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree on the financial services. I was speaking to this organization a while ago where it was a global organization. They were talking about how they had a reward framework and, ranges for all of their roles, but actually the service side of the bit was so broad that they said that they just couldn't have it, and that's the thing that they were struggling with the directive on how to manage that side of the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And for instance, in construction comes to mind as an example, the project management, the range of salaries for people doing arguably a similar role is very, very wide. So those are good examples of that.
So we talked a bit about how the recruitment process is going to change significantly for organizations. Can you summarize some of the key changes that are going to be coming in from the directive as part of the change in the pay processes that organizations will need to implement? And I guess it's a mixture of pay, but also any other HR processes that they need to change, such as job evaluation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've looked at the recruitment piece. Then in terms of elements that concern directly individual employees, one of the things that will be introduced with the directive is the right of employees to request information about their pay, how it is set, and the average salary for men and women performing the same role, or men and women in their same grade. So what is described in the EU directive as category of worker. This element of category of worker is central because that's how the directive is approaching the point around work of equal value. For most people, this worker category would be similar to what we refer to as job levels or grades. So that is one big thing in terms of the rights of the employee to demand that information. There will also be aspects of structure. So you mentioned there's a need to organize jobs in category of workers according to gender neutral and objective criteria. This will require the use of job evaluation systems that need to meet certain criteria in terms of the attributes of work that they are looking at, attributes such as skill and effort, for instance. They will need to be, again, objective, well-defined, gender neutral, because that will then enable organizations to meet the organizational reporting requirements that come with the directive. So those requirements include gender pay gap reporting, and not only at organizational level, which is the case now in the UK, but also by worker category or by grade. That is an extension of these requirements. And that is a very important aspect of this directive, because this will really force organizations to get their house in order, to understand work not only at the organization level, where most of us know gender pay gaps tend to be driven by representation, but at individual grade level or worker category level, there is a greater possibility that any meaningful differences actually could have equal pay considerations. There's also elements of accountability. So going back to reporting gender pay gap by worker category, any differences greater than 5% that cannot be explained or addressed in a period of 6 months following reporting will have to be studied through an assessment that should be conducted in jointly with workers groups or employee representation groups. So that's another big requirement to look and explore and find solutions to those gaps. And then there are elements of removing the contractual restrictions on employees discussing pay. And then there are aspects of the accountability for organizations. There are some provisions that apply to group settings, but they're more specific now. There's also reporting requirements or disclosure requirements internally of how pay levels are set and how pay progression is managed. That's something else that organizations will need to do. So on the whole, I would group them as requirements relevant at recruitment, individual rights of the employee and restrictions that need to be removed, elements of structure, and elements of internal disclosure and external reporting. That sort of broadly encompasses most of the key requirements from the directive.
Yeah, so there's a lot to cover there, and I think there's a huge amount for organizations to do, which is why I guess they have given 3 years to well, initially to member states to bring this into legislation. So the deadline for this is June 2026, I think.
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah. And so a couple of things I want to pick on that you mentioned. So I think the 5% pay gaps, and if it's more than 5%, there's a pay assessment to be done. I think that's going to be really interesting because we know that within the private sector, actually 5% isn't a big threshold, and you will see lots of gaps that are above 5%. And it's how organizations explain, and they might think, oh, we can justify this because of market data or because of location or because of all these different factors. But is that going to be considered justifiable by the local entities to say, yes, you have justified it, or they will say, no, this is not justified and you do need to do a pay assessment. So I think that will be interesting to see how that's done at a local level. Do you, do you have a view on that?
I think that underlines the limitations of the directive in its current form. It doesn't go to that level of detail. And what the directive sets is the minimum level of compliance required. A key point is that needs to be translated into local legislation in each of the EU member countries by June 2026. Some countries may have more stringent requirements, but one of the key aspects that we will be keeping an eye on, an organization should be keeping an eye on, is this element of definitions. What is justifiable? We've been following this case with ASDA in the UK that could raise a very important precedent because it refers to market rates not necessarily being a justifiable reason for having those differences. So we will need to see what case law shows, but also what we find from local legislation. On the whole, you can make some educated assumptions in terms of it has to be factors driven by the job, not the individual, not related to gender or any other protected characteristic. But a big part of it will come down to how rigorous the local legislations are and how detailed the definitions for some of these things are. Otherwise, we will have to wait until claims are raised in the legal system, when there are rulings that we can use as precedent that can give us more clarity.
Did you mean the next case or
Yeah, actually, it's the next case. I'm sorry. Yeah. I was thinking because there are supermarkets involved in this
Yes.
as well. But you're right. The next case was the ruling that brought into question the applicability of market rates as unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I guess it's quite possible that the other supermarkets will will face similar issues like this because we've seen similar cases against them as well. The other point you mentioned, I think, is also quite important, which is the rights of the employee. Where if we look at the UK, for example, and we know with Brexit, the UK is not going to be part of the EU directive. But in the UK, the rights of the employer are actually quite limited because if you think about an equal pay claim, an employee has to find somebody else in the organization that is doing a similar job or the same job. Then they have to somehow go and find out what they get paid. And then they're able to go and raise a grievance against the organization. And so what the EU directive is doing is shifting all of that burden from the employee to the employer to say you have to prove that you're not discriminating and paying unequally, rather than the employee having to prove that they are being discriminated against. So that's again going to, I think, significantly increase the risk on organizations of unfair pay practices, because it's not going to be as hard for employees to prove that discrimination.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very powerful point, that changing the burden of proof. And I think that raises a very important question for organizations in terms of how they're going to approach it. And I think you'll see two main groups of organizations. Those organizations that see this as a matter of compliance and are reactive. And for those organizations, those are the ones that may face a lot of claims, challenges from employees, and will get very busy firefighting. There's another group of organizations that are those organizations that are seeing this not as a requirement, but as an opportunity to really embed a culture of transparency. When you do that, and that's something that we've been advocating for a long time here at 3R, what you do is you start changing the culture, you create trust through transparency, and even though some people may not agree with the way pay and reward is managed, they'll be aware of it. And when people understand how things work and why, it is less likely that they'll raise challenges or claims. And also because these organizations would have done their homework in terms of their grading, the job evaluation, the equal pay audits, and are more likely to have that in place. And interestingly, one of the organizations we've partnered with in a recent webinar, PayScale, did some research around how business performance, business results can be better for those organizations that have actually embraced pay transparency. And those organizations are 17% more likely to have better results than other organizations that have not engaged with key aspects of pay transparency. So if organizations see this as an opportunity, there's the evidence for the business case in terms of results. And I could see these organizations having a much smoother transition to these regulations, and from then onwards, being able to focus on the right things rather than firefighting.
Yeah, that pay scale research was really powerful, and it reminded me of a similar sort of research from Josh Bersin, where they talked about well-communicated pay equity. Their research found that was 13 times more impactful in retaining and engaging employees than higher levels of pay. And I remember when I first looked at it, I was skeptical, thinking 13 times, that's a lot. But I think if you think about it, it's I always use this example of, an organization increases their pay budget from 4% to 5%, and what they're thinking is this is going to cost us an extra £1 million, and we're spending all this extra money. And the employee is thinking, oh, I get an extra £20 a month with this increase. And so instead, that's not really going to help much with engagement and retention. But if instead we spend some of that money on communicating clearly, ensuring fairness, transparency, equity, that creates that culture where employees feel like, oh, I really want to stay here. And so if we think of it that way, that research from Josh Bersin, I think, is again really powerful to say you can have so much more impact in retaining, engaging your employees, instead of just, spending months negotiating over an extra 0.5%.
I absolutely agree with you. It's about the context and the transparency and the positive impact that can have.
So let's say that, there's an HR director listening to this, and they're thinking, either they're thinking, well, we have employees across Europe, we want to start making some of these changes, or it might be organizations in the UK that are listening to, this research and thinking, well, we want to be proactive and start making some of these changes. What advice would you give to those companies that are keen to go down this journey towards more transparency and actually legislation as well, but they're feeling quite nervous about this?
Absolutely. The first step will be for them to educate themselves a bit more about the requirements and the opportunities, and to start the conversation with senior leaders about this in terms of building the foundation. We talked earlier about the importance of senior leaders championing this culture of transparency. So having that conversation and putting transparency on the agenda will be very important to do early on. From that point onwards, you'll start looking at some of the more tactical aspects, starting with job architecture, how they are building their grades, their worker categories, how they are defining them, whether they are based in gender neutral and objective criteria. And they can start getting ahead of the curve by doing some initial runs of this gender pay gap reporting requirements to understand where they may be exposed, where they may have those large differences, whether they can explain them or not, and also starting to make some progress in those aspects of process, especially at recruitment, to start facilitating the transition so that by the time regulations come into force, you're not starting the work, but you're already in a position to start working under those restrictions. In the UK in particular, because the compliance driver is not as strong as the EU, but the UK not being a member of the EU, I think the conversation is about the opportunities and how organizations can benefit from embracing transparency. There are other drivers in terms of trends in the workforce, expectations of employees and the benefits that it can have on engagement, the impact on business role results as we saw from this pay scale. So starting to have the conversation about the benefits, getting the support for the activities that follow that we touched on, the architecture, testing gender pay gaps, changes to recruitment processes, and so on.
Okay, so let's say that there's now somebody listening to this and they're thinking, well, I don't have employees across Europe. We're just in the UK. And maybe they voted for Brexit, or maybe they didn't, and they're thinking, oh, finally, there's a benefit of Brexit. We don't have to do anything with this legislation. What would your advice be to them? Do you think there's a likelihood that some of this is going to come into legislation here in the UK?
When you listen to most conversations, people think there's a realistic possibility that even if it's not adopting those requirements directly, the UK may look to mirror some of this, not necessarily because of regulatory aspects, but in terms of best practice for the workplace. One thing that we've seen already from the Labour government is a lot of noises around workers' rights, fairness, and overall concepts that you would think actually support this type of initiative. So from a business risk perspective, organizations could just cross their arms, carry on, and then be in a position where they need to play catch up, or they can be part of this group of organizations that see this as an opportunity that get ahead of the game and that can start reaping the benefits of pay transparency much sooner. So the first question that I will ask is which type of organization are you? Are you a front runner? Are you a leader? Do you want to be ahead of the game? Do you prioritize employee engagement, or are you focused primarily on compliance as and when it comes?
Okay, and I think the other thing, or the only thing I would add to that is I think there's a strong link between this movement towards transparency, pay transparency, and our targets or objectives around equality, diversity, inclusion. And I think that we need to start challenging organizations and leaders to say, if the leaders are going on about EDI, they should be willing to go down this route, because the lack of transparency around pay actually moves us in the opposite direction when it comes to EDI objectives. So if we're really serious about this and it's not just a PR exercise, then we need to make sure that we're actually making changes and putting processes in place to support our EDI objectives, and we're not just organizing, workshops and marketing campaigns around this.
Have nice posters. I absolutely agree with that. I think there's a question of how serious are you about EDI. I think there's also a financial element to this, because the longer organizations wait, the larger the bill for correcting any anomalies or instances of non-compliance. So even from a financial point of view, there is a driver and an argument to start looking at this now. But definitely the EDI argument is very powerful, and this could be a very good test as to how seriously organizations are taking it.
So that's, I think, thanks for thanks for the whole summary of the directive. I think this covers a lot of areas, a lot of things to focus on. I was also thinking about, I think, some of the myths that are out there around not just the EU directive, but I think pay transparency in general. So, for example, if we do this, then that means that everyone in the organization is then going to know what everyone else gets paid. It's a common thing that makes a lot of people nervous. How would you address that concern?
I think there is definitely an element of education, and hopefully this podcast can support with that. There's definitely not a requirement. Transparency doesn't mean disclosing everyone's individual salary. That is not what transparency. Take your starting point from being clear about the how and the why of decisions. That way you'll start reaping the benefits of transparency, and you'll start on that journey towards compliance where is relevant. There's also some myths around the job evaluation methodology. There is no one single methodology that organizations need to use. It's more about what criteria, what requirements the methodology needs to meet, but there's many different options. Some organizations get very scared because they think, okay, it's going to cost us a lot of money, take us a lot of time to do this right. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. There are approaches that can be time and cost efficient to be able to have the right type of job evaluation and job architecture in place. And finally, in terms of the disclosure requirements, if you're looking at myths, I think one of the points that organizations are more uneasy about has to do with internal publication of salary ranges or external publication of salary ranges for specific jobs. They may be concerned about competitive advantages being lost or getting lots of issues from employees. And I would put that in the myth category. Advertising and publishing your the relevant salary ranges in job adverts will give you an upper hand in terms of your search for talent, may attract more talent, and also may drive away some of the talent that wouldn't be right for your organization anyway, but it'll save you the time to find that later in the process. And internally, this is exactly the type of thing that drives trust. There is the point of getting your house in order for you to be able to do this right. But I think there are a few myths. I think those that we covered now are some of the main ones that we're seeing out there.
Yeah, I think another myth is around, if we go down this route of transparency, then we're no longer going to be able to reward our top performers and differentiate for pay for our top performers and everyone else. And again, I think that doesn't, that's not the case. But how would you, what is your view on that one?
I think one of the conversations we often have with clients is that pay equity is not pay parity. It doesn't mean paying everyone the same. It means having justifiable differences for that. And organizations will be perfectly able to reward the top performance. What is important is how you define top performance in terms of objective and gender neutral criteria. And that can only be a good thing because it makes it clear in the eyes of employees, can make it seem more achievable, gives them something tangible to aim for. So in that particular point of concerns with not being able to reward high performers or losing flexibility in pay, I would say that's another big myth. The key challenge there is to make sure that you have objective and gender neutral justifications for those differences.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point around, defining what is that high performance, because I think what can sometimes happen is, or where employees might resent this is they may see this as favoritism. So a manager will say, I feel that this person is a high performer and I want to give them a high bonus. And there's no, like you said, justification behind that. It's just pure discretion. There's no definition. There's no objective setting. There's nothing to be able to justify that. And I think that's the bit that this addresses, is that making sure that if you are differentiating, and of course you can differentiate, is how do you justify that?
Definitely.
The last thing I'm not sure if it's a myth, it might be more of a concern, with many smaller organizations, that if you have 50 employees, maybe even 100 employees, you might not have an HR team. And how are you going to manage all of these different changes that you need to make to your processes and policies? One thing I was reading in the directive, it was around, they actually said to member states that you need to give support to SMEs and smaller organizations with guidance and templates that makes it easy for them. But do you think that this is going to be more challenging for smaller organizations or larger organizations?
What I would point out from the directive that is relevant to this question is that there is an element of proportionality. So organizations with fewer than 50 employees will be exempt from many of the requirements. Not the requirements at recruitment stage that you would argue do not command cost or significant effort. The more potentially demanding, resource demanding requirements, such as gender pay gap reporting, do have different tiers depending on company size. So only organizations, I think with 100 employees will need to, or from 50 employees, 50 or 100, I need to double check. But for those smaller organizations, the frequency of reporting will be different. The requirement to start reporting is later than for bigger organizations. So there is an element of proportionality that will help smaller organizations cope better. I think that's something very welcome. I think that's something to point out as a positive of the directive. So I don't think there is reason for concern in terms of processes or things organizations should be doing. There will be an element of work, especially for large organizations, that cannot and should not be ignored. But you can easily argue that that's actually part of good people management practices that organizations should be doing anyway.
Okay, great. So I think that brings us to a good, I would say, sort of close to this conversation around the EU directive. Hopefully that gives a lot of people and HR professionals a summary of what's coming and how they can prepare for some of these challenges. But before I let you go, I'm going to ask the question that I asked, I try and remember to ask all my guests, which is, what is your favorite film and why?
I was dreading that question, and in a very consultant-like manner, I may not give you a direct answer, but I'll give you sort of my top 5, top 6 that I would definitely watch at any point, that if you happen to catch on TV late in the evening, you'll stay up a couple of hours to watch it. So that list would include, in no particular order, Fight Club, Amelie, Goodfellas, Inglourious Bastards, Love Actually, and The Lion King. So films that would always be sort of top of mind for me.
Okay, wow, that's really interesting, and it's a very, I would say, eclectic choice of films from Love Actually to Fight Club, and I see you've got a bit of Quentin Tarantino in there with Inglourious Basterds, which is I think some great dialogue in that film. I don't know if you ever watched The Office with the US Office with Michael Scott, and one of the ways that they often decide on something. He says, well, imagine you put a gun to your head, like somebody puts a gun to your head saying, pick your favorite film, what would you pick? Out of this list.
Out of this list. No, the first one that came to mind was Inglourious Bastards, but if I were to only take one, I'd probably take Amélie. I don't know if you're familiar with that film, a French film. Good, clever comedy, has an element of revenge in there that is also very nice as well. Very enjoyable, let's say. It's a very well-made film, so yeah, I think probably come down to those two.
Ah, okay. I'm going to pick my favorite from your list as well. And I think it would probably be between, Inglourious Basterds and Goodfellas. I think Goodfellas is again another great one with lots of great dialogue and some, really memorable scenes. But let's try and link this to the EU directive. So let's say you were going to give a film name or a tagline to the EU directive. What would you say? It doesn't have to be from your list, so I can tell you.
Give me yours then, if you have it top of your mind.
No, so I was trying to think of like film names, and So one that I came up with, Honey, I Shrunk the Pay Gap.
I think that's probably why reward humor doesn't rank highly. No, I'm going to pass on this one. Or call a friend, something like that.
Okay.
And we can ask our friends on the comms team to put together a nice poster for that.
Yeah.
That could work.
We'll do that.
Good.
Okay, well, thanks again, Juan, for all your insights and expertise on the directive and on pay transparency. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we will see you in the next episode of A Case of the Mondays.
Thank you very much, Miss.
You've been listening to A Case of the Mondays. Feel free to share this episode with anyone you think might find it useful. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or would like to suggest a topic for future episodes, get in touch by emailing podcast@3r-strategy.com or head over to 3r-strategy.com to sign up to our mailing list for regular news and updates.